Hi, I'm Paul Nation. I've been training teachers of English as a foreign language for well over 50 years. We're going to look at writing for beginners, guided writing, and we're also going to look at the writing process, breaking the writing down into parts so that the teacher can help the learners with each part of the writing process. The most simple kind of writing is copying, and this can be a useful beginning to a writing course. Learners need to be able to make the letters which are involved in writing English, and if their first language uses different letter forms, then this can be quite a challenging activity for the learners. Repeated practice is needed in order to get good and fluent at forming letters and forming words. In the very early stages of writing, copying texts which contain no unknown vocabulary and no unknown grammatical features is a good introduction to writing. There is a kind of copying which is particularly useful, and that's called delayed copying. In delayed copying, the learner has a text. The learner looks at the text and tries to store 5 or 6 words at a time in their head, and then looks away from the text and writes them down. The learner doesn't look back at the original when doing the writing. So the idea is to look, hold the information in your head, and write, retrieving that piece of information. So instead of copying word by word, the text is copied phrase by phrase. This can be made a little easier for the learner if the teacher breaks the text up, like a dictation text, using slashes between certain words to group the text into phrases. But this may not be necessary for some learners. But delayed copying is trying to add quality of processing to the copying activity, and that quality of processing is added by including retrieval. So by trying to hold as large a chunk as possible in their head before they write it, the learner is helping develop their proficiency in the language. Another kind of copying activity involves the use of substitution tables. Here's a substitution table. This is a very simple substitution table. It involves 3 columns, and the learner has to make sentences by taking a word from each column and writing it out as a sentence. Notice that the last column contains a full stop. That's there so that the learner remembers to put a full stop at the end of each sentence. So the learners will write sentences like, "She has a temperature," "My brother has a serious illness," "She has a fever," "He has stomach ache," and so on. The good thing about substitution tables is that they provide a visual indication of the grammar and parts of the sentence, and they allow the learner to write correct sentences. It's not possible to make errors by writing from a substitution table. Substitution tables can be very useful when learners make errors in other pieces of writing and they need to practice a certain sentence pattern. The teacher can then refer them to a particular substitution table and they can write out 10 or 20 sentences from that table. Another kind of guided writing involves information transfer. Information transfer activities are really useful for a teacher. There are what we call receptive information transfer activities and productive information transfer activities. Receptive information transfer activities involve the learner listening or reading and then filling in a table with the information that they gain from the listening or reading. Here is an example of an information transfer table which can be used for a set of instructions, such as a recipe, or how to make something, or how to do something. Notice the headings in the information transfer table. We have materials needed, the tools needed, the steps. And here we've listed 5 steps, but there could be more or could be less. And then next to each step, we have things to be careful about at some of the steps. Some steps you have to take account of the way in which you do something. So, for example, if you're following a recipe, you might have to beat something well. And the well part is what you have to be careful about. That is, you don't just beat them together, but you beat them together well. Or you can beat them together until they form a smooth, creamy paste. The final part of this information transfer table is the result. That is, when we have finished all the steps, what have we got? When this information transfer table is used as a receptive information transfer table, the learners have to fill in from listening and reading. When it's used as a productive information transfer table, it can be used as a basis for writing. So, if learners have to write a recipe, they can get a table which is already filled in and then use that as the information for writing their text. Or they can make their writing involve 2 steps and gather the information to fill the table and then turn the table into a written text. Notice that in the table, the result appears at the bottom of the table. When writing a recipe, for example, it's most common to put the result or what you are making as the heading for your piece of writing. Information transfer activities are really good because they provide an organized way for gathering information, and they can provide an opportunity for retrieval during the filling of the table and during the production of the text. There are other kinds of guidance that you can provide when doing guided writing. In the example that you can see, which is taken from the course book Fast Track, there are a series of questions which can guide the learner for their writing. By answering each question, the learner then ends up with a written account. Guided writing involves the learner doing some work, but part of the work is already done for the learner. In the example of the information transfer diagram, the information is really done or provided for the learner, and the learner's job is to turn that information into a cohesive text. In the answering questions activity, the main points of information are provided for the learner, and the learner has to provide those pieces of information, the answers to the questions, to write the text. Guided writing involves the teacher doing part of the work and the learner doing part of the work. Let's now look at the writing process. When people do a piece of writing, there are several steps to that piece of writing. Learners need to get familiar with each of these steps because it can then make sure that their writing product is a good product. The first thing to think about when doing a piece of writing is thinking of the goal of the piece of writing. Why am I doing this writing? What goal or purpose does it have? The second thing to think about is who is going to read that piece of writing. And that's called having a model of the reader. This is actually very important. When people do academic writing, they often get a bit confused about who they are writing for. Are they writing for their professor, or are they writing for someone else? And a lot of people writing theses often have difficulty in deciding what level of detail and what kinds of information they should include in their writing. If you know who you are writing for, this doesn't become such a problem. When people are writing theses, for example, they are really not writing for their professor. They are writing for other people like them, who are at their level of knowledge, and they're trying to communicate to those people. So having a model of the reader in your mind is a good way to start a piece of writing. If the teacher wants to help the learners with this, when the teacher sets the writing task, the teacher makes it clear in the description of the task who the writing is intended for. The next step in a piece of writing involves gathering ideas. In order to write, you need to have something to write about. And so gathering information to write about is a very important part of the writing process. When learners are struggling to find things to write about, they will make lots of errors and have difficulty doing any serious writing. So gathering information is a very important step in the writing process. And in a few minutes we will look at ways in which the teacher can help learners with this. The next step is organizing the ideas. People can have lots of ideas, but they might not be well organized and arranged. And it's really useful to look at the ideas and consider different ways of putting these ideas into groups, into putting them into a sequence, or to organizing them in some way so that the reader of the piece of writing will have a clear idea of the information that's being conveyed. Gathering ideas and organizing the ideas are preparations for writing. And the more preparation and the more thought that goes into this preparation, the better the writing will be. The next step in the writing process is what people think of as writing, turning the ideas into written text. So once the ideas have been gathered and they've been organized, then the learner can then start to make written text to express those ideas. Some people have trouble with this step, and one way of helping them is to get them to speak about their ideas first and then go on and do the piece of writing. The next step in the writing process is reviewing what's been written. As people write, they tend to go back and look at what they've already written to make sure that what they're going to write next follows nicely on from what they've already written. So this reviewing is an important part of the writing process too. It improves the quality of writing as the writing is going on. The final part of the writing process is editing. After a piece of writing has been completed, it's useful to go back and to check for errors and to look at it critically to see if it could be improved in any way. We've now looked at the steps of the writing process. Let's now move on to look at how a teacher can help writers with each step of the process. The goals of the writer. Before doing the piece of writing, it's very useful to write down why you are doing the piece of writing and what you want to convey to the person who reads this piece of writing. You can limit yourself to 25 words or less to try and say clearly and distinctly what you are trying to do. Sometimes this is included in a piece of writing. It's called a promise to the reader. So at the beginning of a piece of writing, you might write, in this piece of writing I am trying to, and so on. Sometimes it's not necessary to include it, and it would be strange to include it. But it's quite useful for a learner to try and do it, to get clear in their mind what their goal is in the writing. The model of the reader. A very interesting way of making the model of the reader clear is to do a piece of writing with the reader sitting next to you. As you write a sentence or two, you then pass the paper to the person sitting next to you and say, "Is that okay? Do you understand?" And if the person sitting next to you reads it and says, "Well, yeah, but I don't understand this piece," then you have to go back and revise that sentence and then carry on writing another couple of sentences. This activity gives the writer a very clear model of the reader, because they're getting immediate feedback from the reader. And if the model of the reader is a problem for a particular writer, this immediate feedback is a very useful way of shaping and strengthening their model of the reader. You can get a good model of the reader if you write directly to your teacher or write directly to the other learners in the classroom. Writing for real people helps develop a model of the reader. There is a kind of writing which is called situational composition. In situational composition, the teacher clearly describes the writing task to the learners. For example, you have to write a report for the members of your class. The report is about the kinds of activities that learners do at homework and the amount of time that they spend on them. The report should be clear and readable by your classmates. So in the description of the composition that the learners have to do, the teacher puts in a very clear model of the reader. Gathering ideas. There are interesting activities for gathering ideas. One of them is called quick writing. And what happens in quick writing is a learner just sits down and quickly writes down everything they know about that particular topic. It can be in the form of notes if necessary. And then they look over their quick writing and see, what ideas have I missed? Are there any ideas that I can add to this? In a way, this is jumping a step in the writing process to try and trigger the ideas which might be needed for the writing. Another way of gathering ideas is brainstorming. So the learners work together in groups, and they've got a topic to work on, and they suggest ideas to each other and quickly write them down. When they brainstorm ideas, they don't criticize the ideas at first. They simply gather as many ideas as they can. The second step of brainstorming can be looking at the ideas and saying, "Oh no, I think we'll cut that one out. It's not a very good idea." Or looking to see if there are other ideas which are suggested by that idea. Another way of gathering information is to use what is called topic types. We've looked briefly at the instruction topic type. That is, the kind of information that needs to be included when writing a recipe or a set of directions. That's called the instruction topic type. And having an idea of topic types makes it really easy to gather information. If you're writing any kind of instruction, you have to say, what are the ingredients that I need, or the materials? What are the tools I need? What are the steps in the process? What do I have to be careful about at some of the steps? And what's the result of the steps? There are other really important topic types like the characteristics topics type, and the characteristics topic type answers the question, what is something like? And in this topic type, the major headings are, what category does this item fit into? What are the defining features of this particular item? Is there any particular evidence that we need to look to see if these features are present? Another common topic type is the state situation topic type, and this involves who, when, where, and what are the steps that happened. What happened first, what happened next, and what's likely to happen in the future. These topic types provide useful ways of gathering information that can then later be organized and put into the writing. You'll find a description of several topic types in my book, What Should Every EFL Teacher Know? Organizing ideas. It's good to have a lot of ideas, but the ideas need to be organized well. The activity of reading like a writer provides a very useful way of organizing ideas. Look at a piece of writing which is a good example of what you want to do, and see how that writer has organized the information. And then consider if you can use the same organization in your own writing. Turning ideas into text. Most learners don't have a big difficulty with this process, but if they do, it's quite useful for two learners to sit next to each other. One can be the writer, the other can be the composer. The composer says the sentences that he or she wants the writer to write. So the composer sort of thinks aloud, and the writer turns those spoken ideas into written text. This can help learners who have trouble with this part of the process. Reviewing. One way to help learners with reviewing is to get them to read aloud what they've written so that they can see if it sounds right. Sometimes reading written text seems a little unreal, particularly if you've written it yourself. But if you read it aloud, then it sometimes sounds better than it is when it's written, or it sounds worse, and you can figure that you might need to make changes to it. Editing. Checklists are very useful when editing, and teachers and learners can make checklists to make sure that they've included all the information they need to include, that they've taken account of common errors that they've made, that they've organized their text into paragraphs, and so a checklist of 5 or 6 items can gradually be built up to help learners with the editing of their own writing. Another way of getting help with editing is to get a friend to read your piece of writing. Actually, it's probably better to get an enemy to read your piece of writing, because your enemy is more likely to give you constructive criticism. So someone else reads your piece of writing and gives you feedback on it, saying, I could understand this part well, I didn't know what you meant here, this part here seems very disorganized. And so the teachers can give the learners practice in the kind of feedback that helps. Learners should be encouraged to make the feedback constructive, that is, not just criticize, but to suggest improvements. Knowing the parts of the writing process is very useful for both teachers and learners. Teachers can use the parts of the writing process to help diagnose the problems that learners have in their writing. If learners know the parts of the writing process, they can make sure that they do each part well so that their final writing product is a good piece of writing. Understanding the process helps with the product. So now we've looked at a range of activities for helping learners to write. We've looked at some guided writing activities, and we've looked at writing as a process. A good writing course has a good balance of guided activities and activities which focus on the writing process.